Our story begins with Sophie Miller, a girl as bright and spirited as the Montana autumns she was born into. Her world was one of sunny school days at Willow Creek Elementary, trading colorful bracelets with her best friend, and the comforting thrill of Friday nights at Luigi's Pizza Place, where the old arcade machine still sang its pixelated songs. Sophie loved the scent of pine after a rain shower and the way the distant mountains turned to lavender at dusk. The vast Whispering Pines National Wilderness was the grand, beautiful backdrop to her life, a place for carefully planned family picnics in safe zones. But not a realm she truly knew or had ever feared. Not far from her town, bordering this sprawling wilderness, lay the Savannah Dreams Wildlife Park. It was a newer, somewhat debated addition to the landscape, a large private reserve housing exotic animals, including a pride of African lions. There were whispers in town about the park's shaky finances, and occasional talk of animals sighted a little too far from their enclosures. For Sophie, the distant, infrequent roar that sometimes drifted on the wind from Savannah Dreams was just another sound in her world, as unremarkable as a passing train. She could never have guessed that one day, that roar would be a sound she'd desperately pray to hear. The day her world broke apart began like any other late spring Tuesday. The sun warmed the sidewalk as Sophie walked home from school, humming a pop song, her backpack slung casually over her shoulder. She took her usual shortcut, a quiet, tree-lined street bordering a small, familiar park. But this time, the familiar concealed a terrible threat. A battered, dark-colored van, one she didn't recognize, sat parked near the park's edge. As she passed, the side door screeched open. Before Sophie could even process the danger, a rough hand clamped over her mouth. A strong arm wrapped around her like an iron band, and she was dragged, kicking and screaming silently into the van's dark interior. Her world dissolved into a terrifying blur of harsh hands. The choking smell of stale cigarettes, and a high-pitched whine of pure fear in her own ears. Her school books scattered on the pavement, a forgotten testament to a life violently interrupted. Her abductors were 3 men. 2 were forgettable in their menace, but the one who seemed to be the leader, a man named Kane, was older, with a chilling stillness in his voice and eyes that held no spark of compassion. Sophie didn't know them. Their motives were a terrifying enigma. They weren't talking about ransom. Instead, they spoke in low, urgent tones about needing to disappear, about the girl being an unexpected problem. It was horrifyingly clear they were running from something, and Sophie had become an inconvenient, terrifying part of their escape. The van journeyed for what felt like an eternity, its windows blacked out, plunging Sophie into a disorienting, nauseating darkness. When they finally halted, it was deep night. She was roughly pulled from the van, a coarse sack thrown over her head, and then half-carried, half-dragged through dense, scratching undergrowth. The air was cold, and the night sounds of the forest, the snap of unseen twigs, the rustle of hidden creatures, the mournful call of an owl, magnified her terror 100-fold. They kept her in a dilapidated, abandoned hunter's cabin, buried deep within a remote northern sector of the Whispering Pines National Wilderness. The cabin was a single, squalid room with a dirt floor, a broken table, and a few grimy blankets. A sliver of light crept in through one boarded-up window, keeping the interior in a perpetual, suffocating gloom. For a week, this wretched hovel was her prison. A week that stretched into an agonizing infinity of fear, gnawing hunger, and a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing her small chest. Her captors were rough and impatient. They gave her meager scraps of food, stale bread, cold canned beans, and foul-tasting water from a nearby stream. They mostly ignored her, except to issue gruff warnings to stay quiet and make no trouble. Kane, the leader, would sometimes just stare at her with an unnerving, predatory intensity. A look that made her skin crawl and her heart pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. She would shrink into the darkest corner, trying to make herself as small, as invisible as possible. clutching a little smooth stone she'd found in her pocket before the abduction. A tiny, cold anchor in a vast sea of terror. Sleep was a fleeting, treacherous escape, always shattered by nightmares or the harsh snores of the men. During her waking hours, which felt endless, she'd listen, straining for any sound of rescue, any hint that anyone knew where she was, that someone was looking for her. She thought constantly of her parents, picturing their faces etched with worry, her mother's warm hugs, her father's gentle teasing. The ache of missing them was a constant, dull throb in her heart. She cried until her eyes were raw and swollen, until the tears simply wouldn't come anymore, leaving only a hollow, aching emptiness inside. But even in that abyss of despair, a tiny, stubborn spark of the bright spirit that was Sophie Miller refused to be completely extinguished. She began to observe. She noted the way one of the younger men's hands trembled when he lit a cigarette, the way the other one always seemed to be listening for something outside, the way Kane would meticulously, almost ritually, clean his hunting knife, his movements precise and deeply unsettling. These small details were all she had to cling to, fragments of observation in a world that had shrunk to the size of her fear. Back in her hometown, unimaginable panic had erupted. When Sophie didn't return from school, her parents felt the first icy tendrils of dread. By nightfall, that dread had blossomed into full-blown terror. The local police, led by the town's experienced sheriff, launched an immediate, frantic search. News of the abduction spread like a chilling wildfire, a wave of fear washing over the tight-knit community. Volunteers fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, combing streets, parks, and the edges of the woods. Flyers with Sophie's smiling school picture were plastered everywhere, on lampposts, in shop windows, on community notice boards. Missing, the bold letters screamed, Sophie Miller, 12 years old. The initial days of the search yielded nothing but agonizing frustration. State police were called in, bringing K9 units and a helicopter that thrummed through the Montana sky, a sound that carried for miles. A symbol of hope that dwindled with each fruitless hour. The scattered schoolbooks found near the park were the only tangible clue, a silent, heartbreaking cry for help. The media descended, their cameras and microphones a constant, intrusive presence, adding to her parents' unimaginable agony. Sophie's mother made a tearful, desperate plea on the local news, her voice cracking with emotion. Please, just bring our baby home. She's just a little girl. Her father stood beside her, his arm a pillar of support, his face a mask of stoic grief, but his eyes betrayed the storm of fear and helpless rage raging within. Trapped in the gloomy, decaying cabin, Sophie had no idea of the massive effort underway to find her. Her world had shrunk to those four crumbling walls and the menacing, unpredictable presence of her captors. The days blurred into a monotonous, terrifying cycle of fear and the faintest, most fragile slivers of hope. One afternoon, a new sound, faint and distant, reached her ears, the rhythmic thwump 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 of a helicopter. Her heart leaped with a sudden, painful surge. Could it be? Were they looking for her? She scrambled towards the boarded window, desperate to peer through a tiny crack, her breath catching in her throat, hope and fear warring within her. One of the men, the nervous one, heard it too. Kane! Chopper! He hissed, his voice tight with panic. Kane moved to the cabin door, peering out cautiously through a slit in the decaying wood. The sound grew louder, closer, more distinct. They're searching, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion, which somehow made it even more chilling. Getting too close. We move her. Tonight. The fragile hope that had flickered to life in Sophie's chest was extinguished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a fresh, sickening wave of terror. Moving her? Where? Deeper into this terrifying, endless wilderness? The thought of being dragged further away from any possible chance of rescue, further from the sound of that helicopter, was unbearable. That evening, as twilight bled into a starless, oppressive night, they prepared to leave. One of the men roughly pulled Sophie to her feet, tying her hands in front of her with a piece of coarse, biting rope. The dreadful sack was once again forced over her head, plunging her into a suffocating, scratchy darkness that smelled of dirt and fear. Terror, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. They were taking her away from the direction of the helicopter, away from that brief, tantalizing brush with hope. Stumbling blindly through the dense, tangled forest, guided by one of the men's rough grip on her arm, Sophie's mind raced in a panic. She had to do something, anything. This might be her very last chance. The terrain was uneven, treacherous, and she stumbled frequently over unseen roots and rocks. The men were agitated, their progress urgent and clumsy, their fear making them careless. They were focused on speed, on escaping the perceived net they imagined closing in around them. They were crossing a small, rocky clearing, the moon completely hidden behind thick, dark clouds, when Sophie sensed, more than saw, her opportunity. The man holding her, distracted by a sudden noise in the undergrowth, loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. It was now or never. Drawing on a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed, a courage born of pure desperation, Sophie yanked her arm free with all her might. She ripped the suffocating sack from her head, gasping for the cool night air, and she screamed. It wasn't a child's cry of distress. It was a raw, primal sound, torn from the very depths of her accumulated terror and her desperate, aching longing for freedom. It was a scream that carried the weight of her stolen week, her constant fear, her hunger, her despair, her yearning for her parents, for her life. It was a sound that ripped through the oppressive silence of the night forest, echoing off the unseen trees. Cain whirled around, his face a mask of cold fury in the dimness. "Shut her up," he snarled at the other two. The man who'd been holding her lunged, but Sophie, fueled by a wild surge of adrenaline, scrambled away, deeper into the dense trees that bordered the clearing. The other man crashed after her, and then, from the impenetrable darkness ahead, from the direction she was running, came an answer to her scream. It wasn't human. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her feet, a sound that spoke of ancient power and absolute, primal authority. It was followed by another, and then a third, closer this time, much closer. Cain and his two accomplices froze. The blood drained from their faces, their cruel bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Even in the faint, unreliable light, Sophie saw the raw, unadulterated terror in their eyes. These were men accustomed to instilling fear, not feeling it on this visceral, paralyzing level. Out of the shadows, three massive forms materialized. Three lionesses. Their coats, the color of tawny earth, blended almost perfectly with the forest floor, their eyes gleaming like molten gold in the dimness. They moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied their immense power, their powerful muscles rippling beneath their sleek skin. These were not docile zoo animals. They had the lean, hard, alert look of the wild. Perhaps they were escapees from the Savannah Dreams Wildlife Park, now fully reverted to their predatory instincts, or so it must have seemed. The lead lioness, visibly larger than the other two, took a deliberate step forward. Her great head held low, a deep rumble building in her chest like a distant earthquake. She fixed her intense, unblinking gaze on the three men, and in that gaze was a chilling, possessive fury that was utterly terrifying. The man closest to the lions let out a pathetic whimper of pure terror and stumbled backward, tripping over an exposed root and sprawling heavily on the ground. The other, his face ashen and contorted with fear, fumbled desperately for a pistol tucked into his waistband, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the weapon. Cain, though visibly shaken to his core, stood his ground for a moment longer, his eyes darting frantically between the advancing lionesses and any possible escape route. The lead lioness let out a short, explosive roar, a sound that shattered the night silence and seemed to shake the very trees around them. It was a sound of undisputed dominion, a declaration that this was their territory, and these men were unwelcome intruders. That was enough. The man with the pistol dropped it, unfired, and turned to flee, scrambling back the way they had come, his earlier bluster completely gone, replaced by blind panic. The one already on the ground crab-walked backward in terror before lurching clumsily to his feet and following his companion, his flight awkward and desperate. Cain, after one last, hate-filled glance at Sophie and a look of sheer, primal fear at the slowly advancing lionesses, turned and ran, disappearing into the blackness with his cohorts. The sounds of their crashing, panicked retreat faded into the night, leaving an almost surreal silence in their wake. Sophie was left alone in the clearing, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She was frozen, unable to move, every instinct screaming that the lions would turn on her next. She was, after all, small, helpless, alone, and undoubtedly, in the natural order of things, prey. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, agonizing attack. But the attack never came. Instead, she felt a warm, moist breath on her face. Hesitantly, tremulously, she opened her eyes. The three lionesses had surrounded her. They weren't growling anymore. They were close, incredibly close. One of them, the largest, the one who had roared, was sniffing her hair, her massive head just inches from Sophie's own. Another lay down beside her, so close Sophie could feel the radiating warmth from its powerful body, could smell the wild, musky, surprisingly clean scent of its fur. The third lioness sat a few feet away, a silent, golden-eyed sentinel, her gaze fixed on the darkness where the men had fled, as if ensuring they did not return. Terror still coursed through Sophie, but it was now mingled with a profound, disbelieving awe. These were wild animals, apex predators, creatures of immense power and deadly capability. Yet, they hadn't harmed her. Instead, there was an almost gentle, watchful quality to their presence. The one lying beside her let out a soft, rumbling sound, almost like a purr, though much deeper, more resonant, a vibration that seemed to travel through the ground and into Sophie herself. It was a sound that impossibly, miraculously began to soothe the ragged, terrified edges of Sophie's shattered nerves. She didn't understand it. She couldn't comprehend it. Why weren't they hurting her? Why had they driven her captors away, only to then stay with her? She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the events of the night, too drained by her week of captivity to question it further. She simply huddled there, a small, lost child in the heart of the vast wilderness, surrounded by three of the world's most formidable hunters, who seemed, in that unbelievable moment, to be her protectors. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning in that strange, suspended reality. Sophie drifted in and out of a dazed, semi-conscious state, vaguely aware of the massive, breathing, comforting presence of the lions. They didn't leave her. They stayed, a living, breathing, golden shield around her, their quiet presence a bulwark against the terrors of the night and the wilderness. The first faint hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky with delicate strokes of gray and pink when new sounds reached the clearing. Human sounds. Voices distant at first, then closer. The crackle of radios. The distinct, approaching bark of a dog. The lionesses stirred as one. The lead female rose gracefully to her feet, her ears pricked, her head turned sharply towards the approaching sounds. She let out a soft chuff, a sound Sophie had never heard before, a sound that was neither a growl nor a purr, but something else entirely. Then, as silently and as suddenly as they had appeared out of the night, the three lionesses turned and melted back into the deep, shadowy woods, disappearing as if they were spirits of the wilderness, figments of a desperate child's imagination. They gave one last, lingering look back, not at Sophie, but towards the direction of the arriving humans, as if ensuring a safe transition of guardianship. Minutes later, figures emerged into the clearing. Men in uniform. The local sheriff was at the forefront, his face etched with exhaustion and deep worry, followed by several other officers, their weapons drawn, their expressions a mixture of extreme caution and burgeoning hope. A German Shepherd police dog strained at its leash, whining eagerly, its nose to the ground. "Sophie," the sheriff called out, his voice hoarse, cracking slightly with emotion. "Sophie Miller? Are you in here?" Sophie, still dazed and shivering, looked up. She tried to speak, but only a faint, dry croak emerged from her throat. She managed to raise a trembling hand. An officer, younger than the sheriff, was the first to reach her. He dropped to his knees beside her, his own eyes filling with undisguised tears of relief. "Oh, thank God," he whispered, gently helping her to her feet, his voice thick with emotion. "We found her. She's alive." The clearing erupted in relieved shouts and radio chatter. The sheriff rushed forward, his stern professional composure finally cracking as he saw the small, pale girl, disheveled and clearly terrified, but miraculously, astonishingly alive. He gently draped his own warm jacket around her trembling shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice husky with relief and a deep, paternal tenderness. "You're safe now. We've got you. You're going home." As they carefully led Sophie out of the woods, the first tentative questions began. How had she gotten away from her captors? Where were the men? Sophie, still struggling to process the surreal, terrifying, and ultimately miraculous events of the night, could only point back towards the clearing from which they had come and whisper, her voice barely audible, "Lions. The lions, they saved me." The officers exchanged skeptical, bewildered glances. Lions? Out here in the Whispering Pines? Yes, there was the Savannah Dreams Wildlife Park nearby. And those persistent rumors of occasional escapes or animals wandering beyond their designated zones. But still, it seemed too fantastical, too much like a child's overwrought story born of trauma. They did find the kidnapper's discarded pistol near where Sophie indicated the confrontation had happened, and clear signs of a hasty, panicked departure by 3 individuals. But lions? Actual wild lions? The full story, however, began to emerge with an almost mythical quality as details were pieced together. The search party, guided by the keen nose of the tracking dog, had indeed been closing in on the captor's location. They'd heard a girl's piercing scream, followed moments later by what some of them described as an unearthly, powerful roaring, a sound unlike anything they'd ever heard in these woods. When they finally reached the clearing, Sophie was alone, shivering but unharmed. And the only tracks besides hers and those of her kidnappers were the unmistakable, massive pug marks of at least 3 large felines. News of Sophie's miraculous rescue spread even faster than the news of her abduction had. The astonishing detail about the lions captured the public imagination, transforming a grim crime story into something bordering on a modern legend. Reporters clamored for details, wildlife experts were consulted, and the town, along with much of the nation, buzzed with theories and wonder. A respected wildlife biologist, when interviewed by a national news network, offered a compelling perspective. "It's an extraordinary event, certainly," she stated, her calm, scientific demeanor lending credibility to the incredible, but not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Lionesses are fiercely maternal. A young girl's scream, particularly a high-pitched scream of terror, could, under specific circumstances, be misinterpreted by the lionesses as the distress call of a cub, especially if they were themselves mothers, perhaps recently separated from their own young, or having lost a cub. She elaborated, "Intelligent predators like lions operate on a complex web of instincts. If they perceive the men as a direct threat to what they interpreted as a cub in distress, their protective maternal instincts could be overwhelmingly triggered. They would instinctively drive off the perceived threat. And then, quite plausibly, they might stay with the cub until they sense the immediate danger had passed, or until another, more appropriate guardian, in this case, the approaching humans with their search dog, arrived. It's a rare but documented phenomenon we sometimes see in the animal kingdom. This unexpected interspecies protectiveness triggered by very specific distress cues. She also noted that the proximity of the Savannah Dreams Wildlife Park and the ongoing, albeit unconfirmed, rumors of animals being less than perfectly contained made the presence of lions in that particular area plausible, if still highly unusual and deeply surprising. The three kidnappers, Kane and his associates, were apprehended 2 days later, found haggard, starving, and still visibly spooked, trying to hitchhike on a remote highway many miles from the Whispering Pines. Their story, when they finally broke down and confessed, corroborated Sophie's account of the terrifying feline intervention, though they attempted to paint themselves more as victims of bad luck and circumstance than as hardened criminals. A narrative the authorities found difficult to accept given the profound trauma inflicted upon a child. They were revealed to be career criminals on the run after a violent robbery in a neighboring state. And Sophie's abduction had been an impulsive, desperate act to secure a hostage and silence a potential witness after she'd unfortunately stumbled upon them. For Sophie Miller, the world slowly, tentatively, began to regain its color and warmth. The nightmares gradually faded, replaced by a quiet, profound awe whenever she thought of her unlikely, golden-eyed saviors. She returned to Willow Creek Elementary, to her friends, to the comforting, familiar routines of her life. But she was different. She carried a remarkable story within her, a secret knowledge of the wild's immense capacity for both unimaginable terror and breathtaking, unexpected grace. The distant roar that sometimes still carried on the wind from Savannah Dreams Wildlife Park no longer sounded like just another background noise. It was a personal reminder, a salute, a secret shared. Her hometown also carried the story. It became a cherished local legend, whispered around campfires, told to wide-eyed children. The tale of a lost girl and the guardian lions of Whispering Pines. It served as a potent reminder that even in a world that often felt harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving, courage could be found in the most unexpected of places. And heroes could emerge from the deepest, darkest wilderness, sometimes on padded paws, with eyes of molten gold and a roar that could scatter the most terrifying of shadows. The magical, almost unbelievable event of 2005 served as a profound lesson for all who heard it, that even those magnificent predators at the very apex of nature's pyramid, the majestic kings and queens of beasts, could, in a moment of profound and desperate need, become the very embodiment of protection, their wild hearts apparently moved by a child's cry for help. A cry that transcended the ordinary boundaries between species, creating a bond as mysterious and powerful as the wilderness itself.